Hi, welcome back to Philosophy 101, Morals in Society from Honolulu Community College. I am Chris-Ann Moore. Today we're doing program 28, Jean-Paul Sartre and Carol Gilligan. Actually, this is the last program in which I'm going to be lecturing to you. Our next program is a movie. Once again, you'll be seeing a film. And then the program after that, I will be sitting down and having a conversation with a Hawaiian studies instructor here at Honolulu Community College, Kimo Kiawalana, who will give us another perspective. We've seen that the Western tradition, although brilliant and influential and incredible in many ways, has also throughout that tradition had its flaws. And we talked about the hierarchies within the Western tradition, including the subjugation of women and of other races and cultures. Those voices have been excluded from the Western tradition. And now, as we move in the 21st century, as we have been more and more through the second half of the 20th century, beginning to understand that other cultures have something to teach us. Other cultures have points of view that have been ignored in the West and that we need to incorporate in our ethics. And so that should be a really interesting conversation. So tonight is our last lecture. What I want to do is we're really going to be moving into the 20th century now. And talking about two very important 20th century philosophers. First of all, I'm going to talk about Jean-Paul Sartre, who we actually began in the last episode when we were talking about existentialism. We talked about the beginning of the existentialist tradition in the 19th century with Soren Kierkegaard, who was a Christian existentialist. And then one of the manifestations of 20th century existentialism, which is Jean-Paul Sartre's existentialism, which is an atheist existentialism. After Jean-Paul Sartre, I'm going to talk a little bit about Carol Gilligan, who is one of the contributing voices, one of the most influential contributing voices to feminist ethics. And then if I have a little bit of time, I will do a little bit of a review, but obviously we've got a lot to do today, as we always do. So please make sure you're reading your chapters, you are finishing your study questions, you are considering your discussion questions, you're handing in your assignments, you're getting ready for your final, you're getting ready for your final paper, because those things are going to come up fast. And as a distance student, of course, you know that's on your shoulders. That's your responsibility. Part of the wonder and difficulty of being a distance student is that you need to be responsible for you and getting your stuff in, okay? So let's go back and look at Jean-Paul Sartre. As I said last time, Jean-Paul Sartre lived from 1905 to 1980. He was very much a figure of the 20th century. Covered a bit of his biography last time, his involvement in World War II, his capture, his time in a POW camp, his time with the resistance in Paris, and that he came out of that an atheist. After seeing the really, truly tremendous horrors, the incomprehensible, really, horrors of World War II, Jean-Paul Sartre concluded, as did many, actually, that God does not exist. Or if God does exist, he is not answering. And therefore it doesn't matter. And out of Jean-Paul Sartre's atheist existentialism comes his own answer to that fundamental existentialist question, which is, what am I, the existing individual, to do? You see, existentialism does not concern itself, as do so many philosophies, which, what are human beings to do? Existentialism asks, what am I to do? Not what is he and she and me. What am I, Chris-Ann Moore, in this moment, faced with this decision to do? And how do I answer that question? Now, at the base of Jean-Paul Sartre's existentialist answer to this question, or the method for answering that question, is the same base that we find at and the foundations of all existentialist traditions. The answer, or the method to find the answer, is different, but the foundation are the same. So let's look at those really briefly. Sartre's answer: there is no objective morality, and therefore we cannot judge the morality of any other person. How do we answer that question? What am I to do? We must invent. We must create. You see, for Sartre, existence precedes essence. What does that mean? Well, basically that means that first we exist, we are born. And then, by our invention, our creation, our choices, we create who we are, our essence. You see, some people believe we are born with a soul that has a purpose, destiny, a character, a personality. They look to find themselves. Sartre says there is no one to find. You exist, you're born, and by your choices you create who you are. This isn't a little bit like Aristotle's idea of character. How is character developed? Character's habit. Those things that we do consistently, that they become who we are. They become part of us. Well, Sartre takes this further and says that every single choice is who we are. It is as if we are born really an uncarved block. And our life is a sculpture, and we carve out the sculpture of our life by our choices, by our actions, by what we do or fail to do. You see, like Kierkegaard, Sartre said, philosophy can't help you answer that question, what am I to do? Because philosophy makes rules for human beings, and as we talked about in the episode on Kierkegaard, human beings don't exist. It's a mental category. Sartre would agree too with Kierkegaard that religion can't give you that answer. Religions, or at least religious institutions, make rules for human beings, but human beings don't exist. Sartre would say that science cannot help you answer that question. Science can tell you what you can do, but science cannot tell you whether you ought to do it. Science cannot answer questions of meaning, of purpose, or of morality. And, of course, looking to the crowd is inauthentic. Trying to let some institution define you, trying to let some group define you, joining some clique and then dressing like your clique, defining yourself as the homecoming queen, the cheerleader, the jock, the stoner, the homeboy, the successful businesswoman, the Martha Stewart magazine type. These are types of people, they're not people. And they're types of people created as two-dimensional images by someone else. And therefore, the crowd can't tell you who to be. It can't answer that question, who am I? What should I do? As Kierkegaard would say, what is the idea for which I can live and die? And Sartre's answer is unlike Kierkegaard's. Kierkegaard said, throw yourself on the will of God in fear and trembling moment by moment. Kierkegaard is a Christian existentialist. Sartre is an atheist. There is no God to throw yourself on. So what do? You invent, you create. And therefore, because you are inventing, you're creating, you cannot judge morality. An objective morality does not exist. Sartre said we must face the consequences of admitting that God does not exist. Unlike many other philosophers, Sartre would say morality and objective morality is dependent on the existence of God. And if God does not exist, there is no objective morality. Therefore, by Sartre, we cannot judge anyone else's morality, but we can judge our own authenticity. What does that mean? To be authentic is to be true to yourself. Well, how can you be true to yourself in a world where you don't throw yourself on the will of God and you can't find your answers in any of those other places? Philosophy, religion, science. How can you be authentic? Well, Sartre would say you must logically face the consequences of the fact that God does not exist, and therefore there's no objective morality. You must face that you are creating yourself. You see, we create ourselves, as I said, with each choice that we make, we carve out the sculpture which is who we are. But we do more than that. We also create an image of what a human being is in ourselves. You see, when I make a choice, I not only say this is who I want to be, I say this is what a human being is. I set an example. The sculpture that I make, the creation that I make, me, I create an example of what I believe a human being should be. And so, since I create myself and I create what I believe a human being is, since I set the example, I also have to face that I am utterly and completely responsible There is no destiny that inhibits me. There is no fate that binds me. What I am is what I have created myself to be, and therefore I am completely responsible. You see, Sartre would say to those who, I would have written a great book, if only. Sartre would say, shut up. You either wrote a great book or you didn't. The only person who can say, I wrote a great book, is someone who sat down and wrote a great book. You see, you're utterly responsible for your choices. You have no one to blame but yourself. Now, of course, there are those who later will say, Sartre went too far. We can't be completely responsible for our lives. There are things that happen to us that are not our choice. And Sartre did modify his position a little later in his life because it only makes sense. You can't look at somebody in a wheelchair and say, it's your own fault, you're not a basketball player. Things do happen to us that are out of our control. However, in a way, Sartre is a breath of fresh air. We live in a time where everybody is blaming someone else or something else for who they are. And maybe Sartre gives us a new point of view in saying, you are utterly responsible. The criminal, well, it's how I was brought up. If you saw the way I was brought up, you'd know why I became a criminal. It's not really my fault. Well, we know that upbringing can have a tremendous influence. But yet this propensity to blame does us no good, because then we move outside of our own moral responsibility. We move outside of responsibility for our acts and our choices. We give up our freedom. We give up our responsibility. We give up, in a sense, our authenticity. Yes, alcoholism is inherited. Alcoholism is a disease, but you decide whether or not to pick up that drink. Some people have a tendency to gain weight more than others. It's not fair. But the truth is, you decide whether you exercise or not. You decide whether you're not going to eat or not. And the same goes for those who make heroic choices. Maybe it is easier for those who are well-loved and secure in the world and know who they are. But in the end, the choice still had to be made. So maybe we can find this in-between between Sartre's complete and utter responsibility and acknowledging that there are influences and factors and societal conditions and accidents that happen that are outside of our control. But there's a breath of fresh air here in this responsibility. So, how are you authentic? To be authentic, we must honestly face the truth of our condition. So not only do we create ourselves with each choice that we make, but we also create our world with each choice that we make. You see, as I carve out this block that is me, that is who I am creating an example of what is human being, what is human nature. You see, since there is no God to determine what human nature needs to be, it is I who choose. It is you who choose. And we are utterly responsible for our world and for ourselves. Now, the fact that we are utterly responsible leads to another of Sartre's central concepts, the concept of anguish, the realization that our choices involve all others. What does this mean? Well, basically, that is what I was saying before. When I create me, I'm making a choice for humanity. I am setting an example. I can't say my choice is completely individual and completely private, because the truth is, if I decide to commit adultery, I'm saying that human beings commit adultery. I'm setting an example. My choice involves all other people. So, in essence, I really have to say, when I make a choice, not only is this who I want to create, but is this the world I want to create? Would I have everyone act this way? Now, this is different from Kant's categorical imperative, although it may sound confusingly similar, and students do get it confused. Now, Kant said you must ask, what would happen if your action became a universal law of nature? So when you are saying what would happen if everyone acted this way, you're doing a logical analysis of a universal public rule that is now a law of nature like gravity, and saying, is it possible for this to be done? This is not what Sartre is saying. Sartre is saying when you make an action, when you take an action, that you are making a decision for all of humanity, because in taking that action, you are setting an example for all of humanity. You are making an example of what you believe a human being is, because you are indeed responsible for creating humanity. So when you take an action, in order to be authentic, you have to say to yourself, is this the world I want to create? Let's look at Sartre's method, step by step. Sartre's method. Whether you're solving an ethical controversy or you're confronting a moral dilemma, you have to face the fact that God does not exist, so there is no objective morality or meaning. Therefore, you need to know that you cannot judge another's morality, but you can answer whether the action would be an authentic one for yourself. In other words, any case that you have to answer, the case that you will have to answer on your final, you need to realize that you can't judge the morality of the people in the case. The best you can do is say, would this be an authentic act if it were me? How do you do that? Well, by Sartre's method, in order to create authentically, you must ask yourself, is this who I want to be? Since you are creating yourself with each one of your actions, you must ask yourself, is this who I want to be? Do I want to take this action because this action creates me? You also must ask yourself, is this the world I want to create? Am I willing to have everyone act this way? Because, as I said, you are setting an example. So to be authentic, you must face it. You must honestly face the fact that you are making an example, that you are setting a standard for humanity with each and every one of your choices. And, of course, you have to ask yourself, am I willing to be completely responsible for this act? That is how you would employ Sartre's existentialist method to answer the question, what should I do? Now, of course, in class, when we have moral dilemmas and ethical controversies, we're asking, what should this other person do? For example, common problem these days is there is a black market for organs, for organ donations. But those organs have been taken from political prisoners, they've been taken from the mentally handicapped, they've been taken but from people who have been kidnapped. Sometimes they are actually taken legally, but under such pressure that it hardly can be called voluntary. For instance, in South America, there are many people that are in tremendous, tremendous debt to landowners and businessmen down there. Sometimes those landowners or businessmen will demand repayment of that debt. And when the person can't meet it, they will demand that that person sell their organ on the black market. Or even further than that, sometimes people just decide to sell their organs. The money that can be made in a third world country from a kidney or a lung or a cornea is enough to feed you and your family for a year or more. It's more money than you might ever see in a lifetime. So there's enormous economic pressure to sell organs. And although it's illegal in the United States to accept these organs, they are accepted. And people spend tens of thousands of dollars for these organs to save their own lives, to save the lives of their loved ones. So let's look at a situation like that. Let's say there is a woman in a hospital. She's 24 years old. She has 2 children. She has a kidney disease. Her kidneys are failing. She's been on dialysis for years, but it's no longer working. There's no question. She's going to die if she doesn't get a kidney. She's been on the list for organs legally for years as well, and no kidneys become available, none that's a match. Doesn't look like one will come in time. And then an organ is found for her. And in the midst of celebration, in the midst of preparation for the surgery, she discovers that the organ has been taken from somebody who is institutionalized and mentally challenged, who is unable to give real consent for the operation. Is it moral for her to take that organ? How would you answer that by Sartre's method? Is it moral for this woman to take this organ? Well, for Sartre's method, you would have to begin by saying Sartre believes that because God does not exist, there is no objective morality. Therefore, I cannot judge the morality of anyone else's actions. What I can do is say whether or not I believe it would be an authentic action for me to take. I have to ask myself, would I, Chrisanne Moore, take that organ? How do I determine that? Well, I have to say, is this the person I want to be? Do I want to be someone who accepts an organ under these circumstances? And then I would have to write and explain that answer. I would also have to ask myself, if I was honest and logical and authentic, is this the kind of world I want to create? Do I want to set an example? Do I want to create a world where this is what is the right thing to do? To accept organs from those who are institutionalized and unable to consent. And 3, I'd have to say, am I willing to be responsible? Am I willing not to blame anyone else, not to put it on anyone else, but to be completely responsible for the consequences of my actions? Now, each of those things I would have to answer and give reasons for my answer. And that is how you too would answer by Sartre's method. Acknowledging that you can't judge anyone else, but you can determine the authenticity if it was you. And then tell me why. Is this the person you want to be? Is this the world you want to create? Are you willing to have everyone act this way? And are you willing to be completely responsible? Now, this is quite different from the other theories that we looked at. Thomas Aquinas' natural law theory, what would that say? Well, we'd have to ask if there's a violation of the 4 fundamental values. There's a violation of the fundamental value of life and health. Although the institutionalized, mentally challenged person isn't being killed, their kidneys being taken away, they're being put through surgery, they're being damaged, they are violating their life and health. Is it excused by forfeiture? No, the person is innocent, and the action, although it may be necessary for the immediate defense of the innocent, because the woman is dying, it still cannot be done, because it is an action taken against an innocent, and it's certainly not for justice by the government. Is it excused by double effect? Is the action itself good? Well, one might argue that the woman's promoting her health and life, so we'll give it that. Is the bad side effect unavoidable for the good to be achieved? Is the fact that there's a violation of life and health absolutely necessary in order to achieve the good of saving her life? Well, yes, it does seem so. There doesn't seem to be anything else she can do. She's waited for an organ donor. It hasn't happened. So yes, it's unavoidable. Is the violation unintended, though? No. It is absolutely intended. Does the good outweigh the bad? Yes, most people would say yes. Saving a woman's life, a mother of 2 children, outweighs the slight amount of damage, perhaps to the institutionalized person, and actually the violation as well of the knowledge and truth. But it cannot be in any ways considered moral, because it's a violation of the 4 fundamental values. It is not excused by forfeiture, and it fails double effect because it's an intended violation. See how quite different that is from putting in Sartre's method, which is very individual. It's saying, what do you want to invent? What do you want to create? But at least admit you're creating, at least admit you're inventing, and at least take responsibility for what you create and what you invent. Okay, that covers Sartre's method and how to apply Sartre's method. At the end of your chapter on existentialism, you will find more cases for you to practice on. Now I want to go on to another 20th century philosopher by the name of Carol Gilligan. Now, Carol Gilligan is a feminist philosopher, and her contribution to ethics is called feminist ethics. In a sense, what we're doing now is continuing what we began in our chapter on women's rights. We looked at the view of women in the various ethical theories that we have covered over time. And we found that until the 19th century with John Stuart Mill, women were considered inferior and to be subjected to the will of their husbands and fathers for the vast majority of that time in all of those traditions. But in the 19th century, really coming out of a foundation of human rights that had been established by John Locke and solidified in the United States Declaration of Independence, the French Declaration of the Rights of Man, the foundation for the Glorious Revolution in England in 1688. Out of this human rights movement came this establishment of human rights came a number of human rights movements, including the movement for women's rights, on the basis of human rights. Now, in the 20th century, women have come a long, long way, especially in Western countries. And as women have entered academia, they have transformed academia by coming some coming from an academic perspective. Now, let me ask you, are you a feminist? You see, I ask my students this around this time every year. And almost no student raises their hand. Very few students raise their hand. And then I say, write down your definition of feminist. And then I have each of the students read back their reply. It's shocking sometimes, and even a little bit disturbing, to find out what college students today think feminism is. And after a bit of discussion, I give them the actual definition of feminist as it's found in the dictionary. Who are feminists? Feminists are those who believe in equal political, social, and economic rights for women. Now, after that definition, most of my students admit that, yes, they are indeed feminists. They do believe in equal political, social, and economic rights for women. And then I put in the second definition of feminist, which is those who work to secure those rights. Now, my students are less anxious to be feminists. They admit, a little more reluctantly this time, that they are not feminists because they do not work for those rights, nor do they necessarily choose to. So the reason I'm bringing this up is there's some difficulty always in teaching feminist philosophy because there's often such a negative reaction to the word feminist, or just confusion about what feminism exactly is. Now, the reason for this reaction is multitude. In part, it's caused by a very negative media backlash, or a conservative backlash that has successfully managed to portray feminists in a very poor light. There are others who buy into Rush Limbaugh's and Jerry Falwell's depictions of feminazis as people who hate men and want to take over the world. Some women are afraid of being considered lesbian if they say that they're feminists. Others are afraid of losing privileges that they believe they now have, like having the door open for them or dinner paid for. And they're afraid if the feminist agenda went forward, they'd have to pay for their own dinner. Then there's still others who associate feminism exclusively with the pro-choice movement. And since they are anti-choice, they are anti-feminist. And then there are still others that associate feminism with the philosophy of the ultra-radical feminists, which they disagree with. But they don't differentiate the different feminisms, because this is another source of confusion. There isn't one feminist philosophy. Just as we saw there's not one existentialist philosophy, there's not one feminist philosophy. There's many feminist philosophies. If you had a room full of feminists, I guarantee they're not going to agree on everything. So because of this confusion, this backlash, students have sort of removed themselves from the idea of feminist. But really, essentially, it's saying equal social, political, civil, and economic rights. And the recognition is what we've seen, is those rights have been denied for most of the history of the West, and actually other places as well, but that's what we're looking at. So it's important now that we're discussing ethical philosophy. We've looked at how women were subjugated in the influential philosophies. We looked very briefly, although it's more extensive in your text, on the women's rights movement that grew out of the ethical philosophy, really, of human rights and natural rights. And now we need to look at how women's voices have, to an extent, transformed ethics now that women are getting an education, that women's voices actually can be heard. But first we have to realize as we look at these voices that there are many different feminist philosophies. So that presents a real difficulty in trying to teach feminism, because people think it's just one thing. But there are many different voices, many different ideas. Just look at some of the ways that women have transformed academia, or feminists have transformed academia once they were able to enter into a higher education and become part of the higher academic professions. Some areas of academic feminist analysis include reevaluating traditionally accepted theories, literature, art, histories, etc. In a sense, this is what I did in the episode on women's rights. I am indebted to the women who did that work, who uncovered the prejudices and biases in the ethical tradition. There are women working in all the traditions who have done that, who have reevaluated those theories, who have really exposed prejudices against women in the canon. That is, those that are considered the most influential in their field and who are taught in basically introductory courses. And of course, those prejudices, the relationship of those prejudices to other forms of oppression, of race and class and sexuality. Now, also, other women have worked on recovering women's history, their lost or ignored works. As we saw, Mary Ellen Waithe spoke of numerous women philosophers that we never hear of before her, and a few other women's work, from prehistory, or at least till classical Greek, to the 19th century. There are many women's voices and women's works that have been ignored or completely lost that feminist philosophers have been able to recover. And actually, I'm indebted to them for my chapter on women's rights, for the work, for being able to quote Sarah Grimke and Jane Anger and Christine de Pizan. This comes out of that work. And of course, feminists have created new works that add a feminist or female perspective that has traditionally been ignored. But there are others who are creating new works and theories, but they deny there's any particular feminist or female perspective. You see, here we have to confront the first problem that we run into when we talk about a feminist or female ethic, or an ethic from a female point of view. Is there a particularly female ethic? Is there a particularly female approach to morals and values and virtues? Well, some say yes. Some say women are biologically different, and therefore they have different responses and attitudes. They have a different structure. Others, of course, say that gender is created by society, that what one defines as being female is determined by the society one is raised in, and therefore those differences are constructed. And yet they're no less valuable, because the social sphere within which women function created a specific point of view that needs to be listened to and heard to, because it is different from a male point of view. But there are still others that say, wow, that's a dangerous way to look at things. If we start saying that women think differently than men, if women have a different ethic than men, then we're just buying into something that has oppressed women for the last 2,500 years. It was the accusation that women thought differently that was used to justify subjugation, that was used to justify domination. So the last thing some feminists want to do is claim there's a feminist ethic, or that there's a female point of view on ethics. So you begin to see the difficulty here. Already, in just defining the parameters of the problem, is there a female ethic, there are many different voices. And where some of these philosophers we have a distance from, we can look back and see which voice was most influential, which voice rose above the crowd to be heard. But here we are very close in time, and it is difficult to do that. But there is one feminist philosopher that we're going to look at, as I said today, who really has been very influential. And though, of course, not all feminists agree with her work, and certainly not all women, her work has been extraordinary, really, in pointing out some of the flaws in the male-developed theories of ethics. And that, of course, is Carol Gilligan. Carol Gilligan was born in 1936. I wonder if she likes having her birthday up there. And, of course, she's still alive today. Carol Gilligan is a Harvard psychologist. And her work was originally developed out of her argument or her disagreement with her colleague, another Harvard psychologist's work, Lawrence Kohlberg. Lawrence Kohlberg had taken moral cases and moral dilemmas, the kind that you have been given throughout this course in your texts and in your assignments. And Kohlberg asked boys and girls to resolve this moral dilemma at different ages. And out of the responses that he received, Kohlberg developed a theory of stages of development in ethics. Now, we're not going to go into those stages or the specifics of Kohlberg's theory. For our purposes, what was most important is that Kohlberg determined that often girls were less moral than boys. You see, boys tended to approach these cases from a rational point of view. They tended to judge impartially. Most often they used rules or laws to determine the morality, which is, by Kohlberg's stages, a high level of moral functioning when one gets to impartiality, notions of justice, of rule, of universality, of law. The girls, on the other hand, or some of them at any rate, did not do that. The girls made their moral determinations based on the feelings of the people involved. And they based them on the relationship of the people involved to one another. And so this looking to emotion to respond to moral dilemmas, Kohlberg thought was a lower stage of moral reasoning. Carol Gilligan took exception to that. What she determined instead is that girls reason differently than boys. Girls approach ethics differently than boys do, whether it's biology or socialization, because both are quite different. There is a particularly female approach to ethics, that it is not a lower stage, it is a different and equally valid stage, and actually contains important considerations that are often left out of the male perspective, which Carol Gilligan called the ethic of care. In her best-known work, A Different Voice, which was published in 1982, Carol Gilligan called this an ethic of care, and an ethic of care emphasizes compassion and relationship. You see, women's traditional space has been in the home. Women's traditional role has been that of raising children, of nurturing the relationships within the family, of taking care of others. And therefore, women's morality, in Gilligan's view, arises out of these emotional attachments and very specific relationships. And for a female ethic, there are circles of relationship. Your obligation to your children supersedes other obligations. It is not a matter of impartial calculation in which you throw your children into the mix with everybody else's. Your children have to come first. That is your obligation. That is your responsibility. That is your emotion. Because you see, emotions occur within context. Emotions happen. A feeling is toward this person. They're within reciprocal relationships, not in abstract numbering of human beings. And the male view that has developed over this tradition of Western ethics has tended to disparage emotion, all except for David Hume, really, who thought too that ethics arises from sentiment. Care and compassion, virtue. Now, yes, it is certainly true, as has been pointed out almost ad infinitum, that emotions can lead us astray. They can force us to make poor choices. But we need to develop our rational skills, yes, But we also need to develop our positive emotions. We need to develop those feelings of care and compassion because, as I have included since the first chapter, that they are essential to our moral decision-making, our moral view. As I told you way back in the beginning of this course, when we respond to a child being killed by a drunk driver, we respond from our emotions. Our outrage is from our emotions. When we hear about suffering strangers, our outrage comes from our natural human empathy, sympathy, and care. And so Gilligan suggests that we need to incorporate an ethic of care back into any fundamental ethical system. She doesn't say we need to get rid of an ethic of justice, that we don't need to take into consideration impartiality, we don't need to take into consideration laws and rules. They need to be balanced. Justice without care is sterile. Care without justice becomes narrow. This actually reminds me of a saying in the Jewish Kabbalah that I always found quite beautiful. In the Jewish Kabbalah, it is said that love comes from the balance of mercy and severity. You see, mercy without severity is sentimentality, like a Hallmark card. Severity, of course, without mercy is cruelty. But the balance of mercy and severity is love. You must have both. Anyone who's ever raised a child realizes that. The person who actually overindulges their child and lets them do whatever they choose, that's not love. That's overindulgence. That's spoiling them. You need to have discipline. You need to have severity. You need to have boundaries. But you need to have both. They need to be balanced. And perhaps that is what we really are looking for at this stage of ethics. We're looking a way to balance reason and emotion, to balance justice and care, to somehow fill up in that balance the problem with human rights, which is probably where the seed of a universal ethic really can be found, because human rights seems to promise at least the beginnings of an ethic which can transcend culture, and yet which the plurality and diversity of different cultures can be heard. Human rights seems to present the possibility of agreements of different cultures on fundamental rights. And human rights seems to present a place where people can agree on values that transcend cultures and respond to those violations within cultures, those violations of fundamental human rights that do occur. Now, it's still a seed. It's still growing. But within that human rights, we need also to take into consideration those ideas, those ethical theories that are rational, that demand impartiality, that are based in an idea of justice, and those more modern, more female, more feminist voices that say we need to incorporate as well care, compassion, love, and relationship. It's a complicated demand. And with that, it's the end of our lecture on those demands. So now, really, you need to put all this together. You need to figure out your moral theory. You see, the vast majority that we've talked about, just about everybody we've talked about until Carol Gilligan, they're dead. Aristotle, dead. Socrates, dead. Plato, Aquinas, Kant, Hume, Mill, Locke, Jefferson, dead. So really, what does this all have to do with you? What this has to do with is knowing the ethical theories that have shaped the world that you live in, have shaped the culture in which you exist and make your choices. And these ethical theories So by knowing them, you understand that culture and those choices better. But also, these ethical theories give you tools. You now have a toolbox, you see. When coming up against an ethical dilemma, a moral controversy, you have these tools you can use. There's natural law theory. You can apply that method, see how it goes. There's Kant's ethics. Is it universalizable? Is it reversible? Does it use anybody? There's act and rule utilitarianism. What action brings the greatest pleasure to the greatest number of people involved? Or what rule would bring, what moral rule would bring the greatest pleasure to the greatest number of people involved? And then we move on to looking at human rights and understanding that are there fundamental, inalienable human rights? Are there positive rights? Are there negative rights? Who may be considered a human being? You see, in this process, this toolbox, we've seen all these different views of reality, all of them from a particular perspective, all of them slightly flawed. There's no most wonderful and perfect answer, but all of them also brilliant. And out of this toolbox, sort of this array of paints, all your colors, now you get to pick and choose and to say, what is your moral theory? See, we've looked at the definition of the good in all these different moral theories. For Lao Tzu, it was harmony with the Tao achieved through stopping, striving, and struggling. For Buddha, it was nirvana, the end of suffering, achieved by egolessness and harmlessness. For the sophists, it was wealth and power and fame and money. For Socrates, it was nurturing the soul. For Plato, it was being a just person in a just state. For Aristotle, it was achieving your final purpose as a human being, which is inherent in your nature. For Aquinas, again, fulfilling that fundamental purpose in your human nature. For Kant, what is the good? The goodwill, the determination to do good simply because it is good, rationally and logically. One knows what the good is. For utilitarians, it is the promotion of human flourishing and the alleviation of human suffering. For human rights ethicists, it is the acknowledgement of fundamental, inalienable human rights and fulfilling those rights, and for fighting for justice on the basis of those rights. And for the existentialists, it is bravely and authentically facing your choices and taking responsibility for those choices, especially with Sartre and existentialists saying, is this who I want to be? Is this the world I want to create? And am I willing to be responsible? There's the definitions of the good. What's yours? You see, you don't have to agree with all of them. You don't have to agree with any of them. But by learning them, you should have cracked your consciousness a little bit. You should be able to say to yourself, how do I define the good? What is my definition? Because it's your life. It's your world. It's your ethic. It's your choices. And guess what? We also found out you can't avoid these choices. You're going to run into them every single day. You can make them unconsciously. You can drift back to sleep and live by the way somebody else told you to, by some institution told you to, or by the way your parents told you to, or you can wake up and grow up and make those choices consciously and take responsibility for them. So here's your toolbox to help you define the good. And then, of course, now we know there's a difference between knowing the definition of good and actually being good, following through, doing it. Why be good? Remember the wallet in the first episode? Contained $100 in the driver's license. What's the right thing to do? Why? And then, why do it? I may know that returning the $100 is the right thing to do, But why should I do the right thing? What's the justification for the good? Lao Tzu, it's peace and harmony. Buddha, it's escape from suffering and nirvana. Socrates, it is also escape from reincarnation. Plato, it is a fulfilled happy life. Aristotle is the fulfillment of one's final purpose. So it is for Aquinas. For Kant, just because it's good. For the utilitarians. Because nobody can really be safe or happy while other people suffer. So if you do the right thing and alleviate suffering and promote human flourishing, it'll be more likely that you will have the best of all possible lives. So the definition of good, the justification of the good. Okay, I know what good is. I know why I should be good. So then there's, how do I determine what's good? What is my method? What do I use? Well, Lao Tzu would say, stop. Stop wanting, stop willing, stop striving, stop struggling. Stop this ego labeling mind. Let go. And then you'll know, spontaneously. Buddha, the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. The Sophists, what is ever in your self-interest, what's ever going to get you more fame or power or wealth or money or beauty. Socrates, your soul already knows. You were born, you know what's fair, you know perfect love, you know perfect justice. No, you didn't experience them here, but your soul remembers because your soul existed before. So listen to your soul and you will know. And if you apply critical thinking to particular instances of justice, to particular instances of love, you will remember real love, real justice, and ultimately you will remember the form of the good your soul already knows. It's inside you. Plato, move through the levels of the cave, break from the illusion of what other people have taught you to think. Explore the cave, and then applying reason, you can move out of the cave to a whole another experience of consciousness, to have full comprehension of the good. Aristotle used reason and observation to determine those virtues that will lead to your final purpose, and then aim for them as a mead between two extremes. In your actions, develop those habits that will give you a virtuous character that will lead you to your final purpose and to its fulfillment, which includes health, which includes financial stability, which includes accomplishment, which includes pride and courage and family and friends. If you use your practical wisdom to determine the mean between extremes, you'll shoot for the center, and though you'll miss more often than you hit, you'll get closer and closer. Closer and closer to eudaimonia, to being truly alive, truly awake, truly joyful. Aquinas, what is the method? Is there a violation of the four fundamental values? Is it excused by forfeiture or double effect? Any violation of life and health, friendship and sociability, knowledge and truth, or procreation can only be excused if it is in immediate defense of the innocent or for justice by the government against a non-innocent, or if it's an unavoidable, unintended side effect of a good action in which the good outweighs the bad. Act utilitarianism, how do I decide? Well, what's the act? What's your alternative? Counting everyone as one and none more than one, and asking if everyone is counted as one, just determine which action is going to bring the greatest happiness to the greatest number of people affected. That is the moral action. Rule utilitarianism. You need to make a rule. You've got to see what rule your action is derived from. What universal rule would this action create? What universal rule would an alternative action create? Making those rules universal and public for all time, for anyone who'll ever be in this situation, which would bring the greatest benefit to the greatest number of people. And of course, Kant, is it universalizable? Is it reversible? And does it treat anybody as simply a means? You see, the toolbox. Definitions of the good, justifications for the good, methods for the good, and 30 hours of reasoning, basically. And now it's your turn. I want to know your definition of the good, your justification for the good, your method for the good, and your reasoning. Because in the end, we did this all for you. I already knew mine. It's been great. Film next time, and then a great conversation with Chemo. Bye-bye.